Some scholars go so far as to suggest that the story of the resurrection was created not only to give authority to the church, but also as an extraordinary psychological tool to bring in new converts.
If it hadn't been for the resurrection of Jesus and his rising from the dead, victorious from the dead, we wouldn't be celebrating Christmas.
It's a bit like when you go into the army. The first thing we want is to take over your body. So symbolically, let's say we're going to shave all your hair. As long as you give in on this, we got you. We got your body, which is what we want. In one sense, sometimes the churches, some churches at least, do the same. We're going to tell you something unbelievable that you got to believe. If you believe it, then you will believe that they alone control heaven, that without them you cannot get into heaven, and then they've got you. You've left your brains in the parking lot.
But whatever is said in church, many modern Christian theologians no longer consider the resurrection to be an historical fact. And it's not just a 21st century problem that there are differences between what the church wants us to believe and what people actually do believe.
Look for the resurrection of the dead.
But there have been those who have gone back to the original and differing gospel texts and have found clues to a more credible but no less startling or heretical explanation of what might have happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
You read the story of the empty tomb, and on Friday someone is killed, and on Sunday they're gone from the tomb, and you ask the question, what might have happened? Either God raised him from the dead, which is the traditional Christian affirmation, or the body was carried away by someone, body stolen. And those two possibilities are even talked about in the New Testament.
According to Matthew, the Jews who were hostile to Jesus' followers claimed that his disciples had stolen his body out of the grave and then pretended he was resurrected.
While the enemies of Christians immediately came up with conspiracy theories to explain the resurrection, the stories told by the Gospels are very down to earth. They describe how Jesus was alive again. He ate, he drank, and Thomas could touch his wounds. It's therefore perhaps not surprising that people who have always looked for natural explanations of miracles have suggested that Jesus was alive because he didn't die on the cross.
There are many versions of that story. One came up in a book years ago called The Passover Plot, which suggested that he had been sedated on the cross, that he was removed quite early, and therefore could well have survived. That's certainly a possibility.
The disciples did manage to give Jesus some kind of substance on a sponge.
They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth.
And Jesus immediately died after taking this substance.
When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished."
But oddly enough, it isn't necessary to suggest that Jesus was sedated or drugged by whatever was on the sponge in order to believe that he could have survived. There are stories of people who did survive crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of one of his own friends surviving crucifixion in Palestine in the 1st century.
He's traveling out to a village named Tekoa to scout land for a Roman camp. And he notices that 3 of his friends are hanging on crosses. So he requests that they be allowed to, that they be brought down. And Titus, the Roman general, gives him permission. The 3 are brought down immediately and given medical care. And 2 of them died, but the 3rd survived.
So is it possible that Jesus could somehow have survived? Certainly he was speedily executed, perhaps too speedily.
When you look at the story of Jesus and how he was executed by the Romans, he's on the cross for 6 hours. The assumption is that he's dead. The Roman soldiers checked the body. There were 2 others crucified according to the gospel accounts. And they broke the legs of those to hasten their death because the Sabbath day was coming. When they came to Jesus, they said he's already dead. Presumably, his body's motionless, he's quit breathing. They then prepare the body and put him in a tomb. And presumably it's sealed up and he's dead for all practical purposes. The question, though, is Is he clinically dead?
The question of clinical death is certainly raised by the fact that the herbs Joseph of Arimathea took into the tomb with the body of Jesus were aloes. These are healing, not embalming herbs. So could it be that Jesus was resuscitated in the tomb?
A lot of modern people, I think, confuse the term resurrection with life after death. Resurrection is a Hebrew idea, and it's the notion that someone is in the world of the dead, which the Hebrews call Sheol, and they have their body's been buried, and they resuscitate, or they come back. A term we might use today would be resuscitation more than resurrection. It would actually get the idea. We do have stories, both from the modern world and from the ancient world, where people appear to be dead, and for all practical purposes they are dead. That is, they're not responding to the outside world, but then they do, in fact, revive or come back. We call it resuscitation, but if you want to press the language, that would be resurrection.
Whatever actually happened, the different gospel stories do all agree that the disciples saw Jesus as if he were alive. But if Jesus survived, it doesn't necessarily mean that the resurrection was a hoax or a deliberate falsehood. At the end of the 19th century, the English writer Samuel Butler, in his book on the resurrection, came up with the theory that if Jesus had collapsed in a shock-induced coma on the cross and then recovered, he and the disciples would actually have believed his recovery was a miraculous resurrection.
That still has great credibility if you see it in the light, for instance, of more contemporary developments. Look at the near-death experience in the United States. Something like 13 million people in the United States say they've had near-death experiences. They've seen this white light. They believe it to be some form of miracle. So the idea that in the first century, when they had none of this scientific insight and they had none of these hospitals or whatever to save them, that people thought it, actually makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make them fraudsters or shysters. It actually makes them genuine people who thought they'd witnessed a miracle.
Whatever the circumstances, if Jesus was alive, then he and his disciples face a serious problem.
If Jesus was placed in the tomb and somehow was revived, he himself would certainly think that was an act of the grace of God. I came right to the bars of death and was brought back. But now there's a practical problem. It's a political problem, actually. Romans basically do one thing to messiahs. They crucify them.